to be joined by a high-level panel of experts, including Abhilash Nair, who is a senior lecturer at Northumberland University in the United Kingdom, Hussein Badram, who is the Chief Technology Officer for the region of MENA for Cisco Systems International, Wolf Ludwig, who is the co-founder of the European Dialogue on Internet Governance, Camino Majon Sierra, who is International Relations Policy Officer at DG Connect at the European Commission, Pranesh Prakesh, who is Policy Director for the Centre of Internet and Society in India, and Andrew Pudafat, who is the Director of Global Partners and Associates. I'd like to point out that Index on Censorship has put together a policy paper outlining some of the key issues in this debate and issues relating to the IGF. There are copies over there just on the side. It's entitled Standing Up to Threats to Digital Freedom, Can We Keep the Internet Free? And it looks at some of our examples as a free speech NGO working across the globe. This session is focused on two key areas, which is the takedown, blocking and filtering of content and the export of surveillance technology and its impact on privacy. The panel will explore the ways in which these areas can affect free speech online, and also how civil society, governments and corporations can and should approach these issues. We want to distinguish the censorship that private companies are required to do by states and its impact, but also the voluntary censorship that corporations right now are taking it upon themselves to do. There's a list of questions we're hoping to answer, which is on the IGF website. But broadly speaking, we want to look at is censorship and surveillance more pervasive and intrusive online than offline? How filters and firewalls are impacting on free speech? How takedown requests are impacting on public debate and the public interest? How blanket surveillance and data gathering is affecting freedom of expression, which is extremely pertinent in light of comments made about the UK's draft Communications Data Bill made this morning. And we'll also look at how regulations and laws, including intermediary responsibility, are impacting on digital free expression. We've got some opening comments from our speakers. Then I'd very much like to bring in the assembled audience here quickly into the debate, and also take some tweets which are on hashtag IGF12 and at Index Censorship. So first to speak is Abhilash.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. Censorship is an issue which is probably as old as the internet itself in relation to the internet. In fact, there have been arguments, a number of arguments, which point to the fact that censorship stands against what the internet stands for. And that argument has been advanced by various civil liberty activists dating back to 1990s in the US, when they first tried to censor pornography to protect children through legislation in 1996, which was unsuccessful because the Supreme Court found it unconstitutional, and a subsequent effort at another legislation in 2008 with the Child Online Protection Act, which was also struck down after a long and protracted litigation as unconstitutional. Now, there is a slight difference from about 15 years ago, when censorship, or the talks about censorship, surrounded on state-level initiatives, i.e. legislation, what was the ultimate means of enforcing censorship. Now, the internet and the way the internet functions has in some ways necessitated a change, which has resulted in a shift in focus from state-level legislation, regulation, to end-user sort of focused legislation, where ultimately and eventually intermediaries such as ISPs will have to take a more active role. And the UK can offer a fantastic example for that, the way in which child pornography has been tackled. The ISPs have an obligation now, once they have constructive notice of existence of illegal content on their network, then they have an obligation to take it off. Now, because the overall objective here was the protection of children, there was some degree of universal consensus. Nobody objected to it, and nobody really talked about the implications on free speech. But that changed because that approach of going after the end user or imposing obligations on ISPs was further extended to certain other types of pornographic content, such as extreme pornography, which does not involve any children, it's actually adults. And so it raised further questions: why should the state interfere with the choices that grown-up adults make out of their own sweet will? ISPs and other private actors also have a role with extreme pornography as well in the United Kingdom. Now, that raises, as I said, freedom of expression, free speech issues with respect to what level can the state require ISPs or private actors to enforce censorship. You can find that debate in other areas like copyright as well, with the Digital Economy Act passed in 2010 in the UK, that the ISPs now have further obligations to monitor content. That is a big change from what it was about 10 years ago. ISPs were widely regarded as mere conduits. They didn't have any active obligation to monitor content, but now they're having to assume more and more editorial role in some way or the other. Now, the implication for speech with respect to private actors having to do censorship is manifold. As a starting point, it would be highly, in a practical world, because of the cost associated with monitoring and taking down content, it's highly likely that ISPs would be tempted to take down content without actually investigating the merits of the complaint of each case in order to avoid liability. That's one issue. There is also an issue from the end user point of view, that how is the poor end user supposed to know whether a content is, for example, for copyright, if it's copyrighted or not, or if it's what is at the moment vaguely defined as illegal extreme pornography, if it's illegal or not. So there are a range of constitutional range of free speech, human rights issues surrounding private censorship. I'll stop there. I'll be happy to take any questions after everybody has spoken.
Thank you very much. The next person to speak is Dr. Hussein Madran.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure really to be invited to this distinguished panel. And I thank all participants for taking the time to show their interest by being here. I think the topic is certainly very important and is getting even more relevant and more important given the circumstances, given the occasions that are happening globally, not to mention the Middle East region, which relate directly to issues of censorship and monitoring of content on the internet. I would like to say that besides being working for Cisco as the Chief Technology Officer for the Middle East and Africa, I'm also on the board of ISOC Egypt, which is the ISO chapter in Egypt, and perhaps most of my comments will relate to that capacity more than a vendor specific. As you know, Egypt has seen dramatic events happening during the revolution of January 25th, 2011. We have seen the government taking action by gradually cutting down communication services, including first social media and then mobile, and then fully the internet access to citizens across the country, which is really a drastic action that was thought to be the way to stop the revolution, which of course unsuccessful. But this has triggered actions from different parts of society. And the reason for, or the justification for cutting telecommunication services lied in the one definition in the telecom law that allowed government to intervene in case of a major disaster or major event that can damage what is mentioned, public security or national security. So that was really the justification. So based on that, there was a public outcry to modify the telecom law, and that is currently under process. There were some public hearing regarding some articles in the law, including this one in particular, but due to the issue of Parliament being changed, so it has not been ratified yet. But that was the trigger for this discussion. We see also the engagement of civil society trying to raise awareness of community. We see that people are not really aware of if they have any rights to the content on the internet, if they see content being harmful or content being taken down without justification, who should they talk to, what power does their opinion have, and this is a lack of perspective or lack of awareness part of regarding communities at large in the Middle East, that their opinion really counts, and what vehicles they should use to make their opinion heard. And we can see a clear example on this with the video that was propagated on the internet a month and a half ago that many of us find offensive regarding Prophet Muhammad. So the outcry was seen in terms of demonstrations, but if there is another way people can raise their voice and have their interests being flagged and taken into consideration, I think this is very appropriate to raise such concerns for people who run social media and run over-the-top operators. We see also issues related to privacy being brought into the front. Privacy of personal information, privacy of private content that's not intended to be shared, but is shared through illegal means, through phishing, through malware and viruses. So these kinds of actions are gaining some attention, but in large, we see still in the Middle East, compared to the developed world, engagement of civil society is quite lagging behind. It's not there yet where it's supposed to be, and that's an issue. Government is taking the lead, but as you know, government have lots on their mind, and perhaps communication is not the top priority. Privacy in communication is top priority. So we see a role by the civil society to play, and that requires some attention and some perhaps engagement with other civil societies globally to see best practices and how we can get about addressing problems that have been seen in other parts of the world. Engagement with writing laws, I mentioned, particularly on the privacy side, but also with the constitution. We have opportunity in Egypt now to we're writing a new constitution, and there's civil societies and others made the point that privacy of information should be protected in the constitution, and that was accepted, expanded to digital information. Was known to be on telephone conversation or telex in the previous days. Now has been extended, or will be extended, we hope, to also information online. As privacy of that information should be protected in the constitution. Hence, laws should be written to accommodate this constitutional right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak on this panel. In my opinion, the problem is older than the online age. The privatization of censorship, due to my observation as a journalist, has started before. There was a kind of a structural censorship by media concentration over the last 30 years. And the media concentration and the corporate journalism undermined the diversity of media reporting what we had 30-40 years ago. So there is already a kind of starting point before the digital age, and over the last couple of years we could observe all sorts of reasons and so-called best intentions what may have an impact on freedom of expressions. It started with a whole security debate. Security is always one of the best reasons to undermine basic civil rights or whatsoever. Child porn is another context where, by best intentions, government suddenly started to talk about how can we control or block content on the internet. Another issue is existing copyright regulation. where right holders and the right holders industry are at the moment very at the forefront to think about all kind of control mechanisms to protect authors' rights, as they always argue. What I think, in my opinion, as a journalist, it's one of the most hypocritical debates I've seen over the last couple of years. I think there is an importance to distinguish clearly between authors who do in many cases have no rights about their works any longer. So it's an initiative by the right holders industry, and the right holders industry on a broader level is trying its best to control content, and this may impact freedom of expression as well, or imply some sort of censorship. In any cases, in my opinion, the principle of open access is at stake, and we have to be very careful over the next couple of years, and we have to be very vigilant by creating awareness in civil society to fight against those tendencies. At the end of my intervention, let me just mention a good example, a best practice. I think, let me take the case from Reporter Without Borders, Germany. They, some weeks ago, published a press release and a short paper on surveillance technology, making the point on what surveillance technology may mean, may affect, etc. And they try to create a debate on how can we control the export trade of surveillance technology. And I don't want to go into further details. If anybody is interested, she can ask me afterwards. But I think it's basically an excellent idea to think about having a similar type of trade regulation as we have for conventional arms. Because surveillance technologies in the wrong hands has disastrous effects. And as we, by existing rules and laws and regulation, do already control conventional arms, I think we should think in the same direction with surveillance technology. This is, in my opinion, is a starting point of a discussion. I think it might be controversial, but let's start with it.
It's a very excellent segue, because the European Parliament has just voted on a motion calling for export controls on surveillance technologies, which leads us to our next speaker, Mina.
Hello. Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Mike and Industry and Censorship, for giving us the opportunity today to be present in your workshop. I work for the European Commission, and my role today is basically to introduce the solutions, or what we think is the solution to the several programs that have been proposed today. Especially, I will tackle as well the one related to dual use, and as well of exports that we've enforced against Syria and against Iran. I think that already in 2010, when this conversation started to be perhaps more heightened, freedom of expression was already a big priority for the European Commission in terms of policies, but I wouldn't deny that the Arab Spring acted as an extreme wake-up call to all of us, not just in terms of the risks for freedom of expression, but also of the consequences of inaction on the side of public institutions, which are going to be held responsible in ultimately of a lack of freedom of expression of our citizens and of our internet use. users. I would like first to address what we've done in the area of corporate social responsibility. We think we are a big supporter of self-regulation, although I agree with you that in several cases, like in the case of dual use, self-regulation has not delivered the results that should have been delivered. However, we're trying to strengthen our conversations with private sector. That's what we've done through the entire year, organizing a couple of round tables, and particular in how to apply the United Nations RUGI framework for human rights and business to the particularities of the EU businesses, which you may understand that the Global Network Initiative could be perhaps is a very good framework, but could be not well adapted to the EU framework, because basically our internal market is based on a strong mesh of SMEs, which may adopt a framework like GNI, which is mainly set for broader companies and telecom companies. So our intention with this framework is to come up with concrete guidelines on issues, particular issues that affect EU industry. We will do so by the beginning of 2013. We're a little bit delayed, 3 or 4 months. The reason why is because we are publishing for the second time these guidelines, these draft guidelines for comments. I think it's a very good framework as well, because it's entirely multi-stakeholder. As you may know, there are many other frameworks. We have here today with us also Telia Sonera. They are part of one of them. I think it's good for us, and it's an intention of the Commission to try to bring together around the table all these players so that we achieve critical mass, and so that, because if we may run the risk of having several initiatives, corporate social responsibility initiatives coming from private sector, civil society, governments, so it would be good to streamline the same objectives in all of them. Secondly, I would like to talk about the no disconnect strategy, because that's how the Commission, and in particular DG Connect, and our Commissioner is addressing problems regarding freedom of speech in the Internet. I must say that it has a strong foreign policy component. We're not addressing what happens in terms of censorship and surveillance within the EU, but initially the starting point was the South Mediterranean, but I don't think that technology can be restricted to just one geographical region. So in the end, this will spread through Europe, I guess, as well. The main 4 strands of the no disconnect strategy are educate online journalists, human rights offenders, and even end users, internet users, on the risks and on the threats that the internet behavior can imply. We have 2 severe challenges. One of them is that these guides require a constant update, and second is because not all the authoritarian countries that are restricting internet access have the same technological level of development, and therefore it's not the same guidelines for country A that for country B. Let's put Iran. Iran is a highly technological environment. I understand that we have to strengthen our efforts in those cases. Second, we have to strengthen our research portfolio in order to develop privacy-enhancing technologies. Also, we're developing mesh networks, which I think is also a good solution. And we are coming up with something called the European Situational Awareness Platform. That is intended to give us almost real-time knowledge of what is happening on the ground in terms of internet censorship and surveillance, in the sense that we're aiming at connecting dots like failure at the internet at security level, or security events, or shutdowns, or problems with connections, with what is happening on the ground in terms of restrictions to activists, and as a result have a better basis or an evidence-based policy making in order to act. And thirdly, as our colleague also mentioned, that cybersecurity is one of the Achilles heels of internet freedom, or of freedom of expression as such. You know that the European Commission is coming up with a new cybersecurity strategy in the coming months. Our services are responsible of ensuring that there are human rights considerations included in the strategy, and in particular human rights impact assessments before any security laws are issued or security regulation. And we come to the most important part, which is surveillance, restriction of surveillance and censorship, restriction of trade. We are providing technical support to our colleagues of DigiTrade on what concerns the dual-use regulation, and we welcome very much also these amendments from Marietje Schaake. I would just like to highlight a certain word of caution, saying that perhaps this is not the only solution, and we tend to resort to it as if it was a silver bullet. And there are several problems of including in that annex certain technology. It's very difficult for an institution which has some checks and balances to be able to update that list as technology evolves. So as a result, we may end up putting in that list surveillance gear or censorship gear that is either outdated or that it causes negative consequences for human rights activists that as a result have no access to certain encryption products or certain software products that they do need also to protect themselves. And the main problem is that as far as we're not addressing the demand and we still try to kill the supply, we're never going to get to a final good result. And that I leave it at that because I guess that other speakers also have the role today.
Thank you. We've got 2 more speakers, and then we're going to move into questions from the audience. So our next speaker is Pranesh.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you to everyone else. I'd like to first highlight a few very general principles about how we contextualize censorship, especially when it comes to the internet. Then a few points on free speech, a few points on surveillance. Censorship generally can be of, I believe, 4 types. One, state censorship. This can be legal and extra-legal. So sometimes the police, for instance, can extra-legally seize books or ask for domain name blocks, as has happened in India when cartoonsagainstcorruption.com was asked to be blocked by the Mumbai police. They wrote to the DNS hosting company asking them to remove it, but they don't, under the law, have any such authority. It can also be state-aided private censorship, and this too can be legal or extra-legal. We've seen situations, for instance, where copyright law has been used as a tool of censorship. So right now, there's a case going on in the Indian courts to which we are also a party now, which is against, which has been filed by one of India's largest record labels, T-Series, against MySpace, the almost dead News Corp corporation. In that case, the judge has held, very worryingly, that just because of the fact that there was copyright infringement that happened, despite MySpace showing that every time they got a request for removal, even before, without having proper processes even, they actually removed just on the basis of complaint, not on the basis of proof, just on the basis of complaint. And MySpace having asked the record label to come on board with their program of saying, give us your songs and their fingerprints and we can eliminate those, despite those offers being there, and despite MySpace actually not having the technological ability to monitor each and every upload onto their website for copyright infringement. Despite all of that, the judge held that MySpace is responsible. So despite best efforts, if even one instance of copyright infringement happens, the host becomes liable under the interpretation of the law according to this one judge in the Delhi High Court. We're challenging that, and I think if we have this principle, then no intermediary that's a web host can exist. You have to, in essence, rent your own servers. There's no possibility of using, someone else as an intermediary to do so. Private censorship is the third category, and this too can be legal and extra-legal. I'll focus more on the one instance of the extra-legal. The ISP Reliance, they're one of the world's largest ISPs. They are amongst the owners of the flag network that goes around the entire globe, the undersea cable that goes on, through the entire globe, and they're quite large in India too. Now, the hacker collective, or maybe it's the hacker uncollective, Anonymous, they hacked into Reliance's servers and got a list of all the websites that Reliance has blocked. Now, in this list, we saw stuff relating to specific, that many links were there to, which were about a specific Reliance employee, a very senior Reliance official who had been put in jail during investigations of the 2G scam that's still ongoing in India. And these were, and the day that was released, I checked on Reliance's networks and I couldn't access many of the websites, while in other networks I could access those websites. The next day, magically, I could access them again on Reliance's networks. They had unblocked it, but evidence continues to remain that they had tried to block this, because some of these videos had been uploaded on YouTube and some on other sites, including Vimeo. On YouTube, you see that one of Reliance's companies has actually filed copyright takedown notices, and on YouTube those videos remain unavailable. While on Vimeo, those same videos, which are of all kinds of things which big entertainment, the Reliance company, couldn't have copyright over. Things like a dog trying to get out of, like a short home video of a dog trying to get out of a door, of some people in one room clapping, of all kinds of things, not from films or any such, were sought to be blocked because they were an attack in very subtle way on Reliance and corruption. This shows us that transparency is required. We need to know what is blocked, even if we can't access it. We need to know how we can remedy it in case that what is blocked is felt by some to be wrongly blocked. Then the fourth is societal censorship, and this is usually extra-legal, and this is what leads to self-censorship. Now, if we have a situation where in the law, the publication of a work that creates enmity between communities is held to be illegal, then what happens in those situations, as we've seen in India in the past, where one community goes, beats up one professor who published a book, or in this case, who helped with the research for a book on a king, on a medieval king in India, and they got enraged by it. What do you do in such situations? The court eventually, thankfully, held that you can't go on riot and use that as proof that the government should ban the book, because the government in this case did ban the book, and thankfully the court overruled it. But this is a real issue, and this does lead to self-censorship in the future. One very important point that emerges through all of this, I think, is that issues of intermediary liability, etc., are very important. On the internet, there is no possibility of speaking freely, really, the way that there is off the internet. And by this, what I mean is that there are no public spaces online. Now, Frank LaRue, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, in his report last year, spoke about La Plaza Publica, which exists in Guatemala, the public squares, right, and the internet as embodying this. I respectfully disagree with him. I believe that on the internet, we live on shopping malls. They are public in some ways, but it's all private. Okay, and the fact is, even if you own your own, under current systems of the internet, even if you own your own on contracts, we've seen the rise of the consumer rights movement since the 1960s, right? So there are limitations that can be put on contractual freedoms as well. Now, having exhausted that, so I'll just in around a minute and a half like to go through, just flag some important issues when it comes to freedom of speech. The issue of intermediary liability. Right. In India, we're facing a big problem with a really bad intermediary liability law that came into force last year. We found by sending frivolous, fake, false complaints to 7 different intermediaries that 6 out of those actually removed it just because of the fear of the law, and that's not a good thing. And we have to see how the Ruggie principles can actually apply. On the issue of surveillance, which I think is very important and interesting, the role of the private sector has actually changed. The power of the governments have actually changed through the years. When it came to the world of telegraph, it was different. What the governments could do, they could just take over a particular, telegraph station in essence, right? On the internet, it's more complicated. It's difficult. It's different, importantly. So now we often see that governments have to work with ISPs, but that raises the question, which I don't think we have clear answers to, in terms of what role should the private sector have when faced with issues of surveillance. Should governments have to go through private sector players when it comes to these kinds of things? I don't think we have clear answers to these questions. There's the issue of costs. If one good enough response often is that it imposes too much costs on the private sector to build in surveillance. But what if the government says we'll share the costs? In the past, we've had Airtel, an Indian ISP, publicly in its report stating that we received 400 plus letters of commendation from law enforcement agencies around India. But they did not reveal in that same report how many times they'd been asked to conduct surveillance in that past year. And so these are very important questions. There's the issue of telecom licensing, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just end here. I don't want to overextend my time too much. But I think for some of these issues, there just aren't easy answers.
I think it's worth noting that with the UK's draft communications data bill, the state will be picking up the tab and has said it will pick up the tab for an increase in state surveillance. That's a very real issue. Finally, we have Andrew.
Thanks very much, Mike. Can everybody hear me through the headphones? Just waving. Thanks. A lot's been said, so I'll try not to cover the same ground. My first reflection is that the privatisation of censorship online is actually a function, in some ways, of the ecosystem of the internet itself, which is one of the problems we have in dealing with it. Because the internet is essentially a dynamic ecosystem, evolving continually, without central control, central regulation and central planning, and that's one of its real strengths. And the governance of the internet is essentially functional. The people who run ICANN, the root servers, the engineering protocols are like the engineers who keep your car on the road. They don't care where you drive it, how fast you drive it, and where you go. They're just concerned with keeping the network up and running. And now, whereas in the offline world, there are clear procedures if you want to adjudicate human rights. So in the offline world, if a newspaper publishes an article which is alleged to be defamatory or inciting hatred or violence, there is, in a decent legal system, recourse to the courts who make that final decision as to whether any restriction on speech is allowed. Offline, there is no policy governance, there is no jurisdiction. Online, there isn't that jurisdiction. And to be honest, as a human rights activist, I don't want there to be transnational jurisdiction over the internet and regulation to make those kinds of judgments, because I'm very fearful about where we'd end up in terms of censorship and control. So it seems to me there's a bit of a dilemma. As an offline activist, I can campaign in any country knowing what the legal system is and the redress is to challenge an act of censorship. Online, I'm dealing, as Pranesh said, not with a series of public spaces in the offline sense of the world, but a series of private spaces run by a whole network of intermediaries, many of whom may be vulnerable to pressure. Now, that decentralized nature of the internet, I think, is both a strength, because the large number of intermediaries, the web hosting services, the internet service providers, the domain name servers, etc., that very vast and dispersed nature means that there's a strong network and you can route around lots of problems, but it also creates vulnerable choke points. Very small companies in countries which, to be honest, as soon as somebody from the Ministry of Information Communications picks up the phone, they're not going to mess with that. This is their business, their livelihood, that's all they've got to do. If they're asked to remove content, they'll remove their content. They're not going to look at human rights standards or principles before they do that. So we have, I think, quite a significant challenge, because the second aspect of this is that we actually don't know what the censorship is online. I have no idea what it is I can't read. I have no idea what it is I can't access. If an internet service provider chooses not to resolve my request for access to a particular domain name, I don't know that. I just may get a message back saying site available, not down, or I'm hung in a queue forever. And if I'm in China or Iran, I may guess what the situation is. But if I'm in the United States or the UK or Germany, I don't really know what the situation is and why I can't resolve that domain name address. So as an advocate, it's very difficult for me to campaign on these issues because I simply don't have the information about the nature of that censorship and surveillance that's happening throughout the world. And it's particularly worrying for me that online, I think companies, and I don't blame them for this, but if they look to their business model, they will tend to play safe. A company will not go out on a limb to defy a request for censorship except under extreme circumstances. And certainly when it may not have the backing of its host government, it may be uncertain of the political environment, it may be vulnerable to a tax raid or any of the other tricks that governments get up to in dealing with the corporate world. So if the corporation is in a conversation with a censor, the balance of power, it seems to me, is very, very uneven, and that's very worrying. And we're also seeing an increasing trend in terms of censorship, in outsourcing the censorship and the attacks on independent human rights activists to criminal networks, principally based in Russia. And I've seen this in a number of projects that I'm working with, whereby an African government that doesn't have the technical capacity to bring down an anti-corruption website itself outsources that to a Russian mafia gang. Interesting how they were able to reach that Russian mafia gang. We can all speculate on that. And there's a massive DDoS attack on that organization's website, and the web hoster throws the organization off because they can't, because in one case, in a case, I'll say it, in Burma, under the military regime, a very small anti-corruption site was thrown off its web provider because the attack was so large, hundreds of thousands of websites were brought down. The whole domain crashed because of the volume of attack. So in those circumstances, what is a web server going to do? They're going to say, get off my site, I don't want to host you anymore, which is what happened with WikiLeaks. You know, their domain name server refused to resolve requests, and suddenly you couldn't access the WikiLeaks information. There wasn't a kind of judicial decision anywhere that enforced that. That simply happened. And when the Egyptian government said to 6 ISPs, shut down the internet in Egypt, it got shut down in Egypt because those companies did not want to be in a situation where they're fighting with the people who set their regulatory and legal environment for them as companies. So we've got a big challenge. I think we should not be, clever about this. This is a challenge that faces anyone who believes in an open and relatively unregulated and internet where we don't want a lot of content controls. How we then deal with the fact that the internet is essentially a series of private constructions with all kinds of vulnerabilities. It seems to me there are three things that could happen. One is that we have proper monitoring and transparency about what's actually happening. And I'd like to hear the argument why companies should not, at the very least, say that they have taken down material for this factual reason, or they've been asked to take this down, or this is what they've taken down in response to what request. So at least as advocates, I wouldn't be asking them to do any more than that, but at least that would give me information about what was going on. And then I could identify the kind of pressure points I wanted to exert if I was dealing with the person requesting that. The third is to get companies to be robust in the way they deal with requests. And I think that does mean, and the Ruggie principles have been mentioned, and I think a rigorous application of the Ruggie principles by companies which embraces the requirements to build human rights impacts into audit and risk management, and particularly the risk management framework of a company, that could be very advantageous. That could at least give us a little bit of a leverage to make sure that requests that could be fairly safely ignored could be dealt with by the company. And again, the company can then look for external support if it's facing something bigger. And the final point, and the one that I'm torn about, but which many human rights people support, is actually to introduce the law, the national law, into this environment and say that any request to take down made to a company in a country requires a local court order, and it cannot be acted on by a local court order. Personally, I think if we can't resolve it by campaigning, and if you like, by self-regulation, by implementing Ruggie, where we'll end up being is really pushing for the whole framework of restrictions on free expression to be enforceable in national courts, rather than, and that private arrangements between intermediaries and governments or third parties would be made effectively unlawful or illegitimate. Now that's a big step, and I think there's a lot of debate about that in the human rights movement online, but I think that's clearly, for me, looming in the next few years.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Can everyone hear me? Yep, good. Right. I'm going to open this up straight away so we get questions from the floor. I think I'm going to have to be the roving mic, and I'm going to direct questions at individual panelists rather than the whole panel, so that we can get more questions answered. So who would like to open? I'm going to come this way. We've got a gentleman here.
So my name is Robert Guerra. I'm with the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto in Canada. I have a comment and I guess a question. At the Citizen Lab, we've been producing a couple of reports on how surveillance technologies have been used my name is Robert Guerra with the Citizen Lab. The Citizen Lab's long been doing research work on both internet censorship, surveillance, and the use of equipment that's being used against NGOs around the world. I guess the question is what the panelists think in terms of, when law enforcement does surveillance or it does takedowns, there are oversight mechanisms that the police is accountable for. And when this gets shifted to the private companies, the oversight mechanisms don't usually reach private sector. So I'm just wondering, as we are seeing kind of a privatization of censorship, whether we would like it or not, could the laws around oversight also be updated so they would include the private actors themselves, to bring them in a way like data protection protects the users in terms of what governments and companies have with their data, in terms of could that be something to try to at least independently get a sense of whether companies are complying to the Ruggie principles or other issues. So I'm just curious in terms of if that was a useful legislative tactic as well.
We'll take another question before we answer that. I think, can we direct that question at Andrew to start with, if you open with this.
Hi, my name is Khadija Ismailova. I'm journalist in Azerbaijan, and I've been listening to very concerning. Can you hear me well? Okay. Very concerning remarks regarding desire to have sort of censorship of a sensitive content in internet, with the example of the video insulting Prophet Muhammad. And well, I'm a victim of the internet insult over internet. But internet is not to blame for that. It's my bedroom was bugged by the government, and then the video from my bedroom was filmed and put on the internet in order to silence my investigations in Azerbaijan. So the first thing that friends suggested me is to ask the government to take it out of the internet, to ask Ministry of Communication to somehow the block website inside the country, because it had a life threat for me in Azerbaijan. So if I would do it, that would be served as an excuse by the Ministry of Communication for years from now to block websites whenever they want. So I didn't do that. It's me, it's my life, and it's not somebody whom I respect, but he lived many years ago and died many years ago. So, well, in my case, I decided that freedom of expression is more important than the life threat video that is posted online. And well, I decided to go to the hosting company to tell them that the video is not up to their rules, and they stopped the hosting of the company of that video because it broke their agreement with their client. So the agreement between the hosting company and the client was broken by the video content. So I think it's the way things are in the world regarding internet regulation. I think that's enough. We have enough content regulation, and it's important that we know who is accountable for things. And I think the hosting companies should set the rules between themselves and their clients. YouTube has agreement with any user that is using that. So I think that's perfectly enough in that term. And it's another thing that comes to my mind within this circulation. In Azerbaijan, the Ministry of National Security has right to come to any communication company and tell them that they start a surveillance without, and Ministry of National Security is responsible for legalness of this surveillance. It's not the company, it's not the communication company. And I think that is the concerning trend. I think communication providers should be responsible on who is having surveillance over their lines, and they should also be accountable for providing this information to the secret services. In case of Tele-Sonera, Azerbaijan is one of the countries where they give this information to Ministry of National Security. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Khadija. I think so. The first question we'll have Andrew and Pranesh answer, and the second question I think would be good to hear from Wolf and Hussein.
I very much agree with Robert's point that as you privatise security functions, surveillance functions, there's a great danger that the mechanisms of oversight we do have disappear. It seems to me it's not the status of the organisation carrying out the business that matters here, but the nature of the function. And I think if there are public functions, they should be subject to proper oversight and supervision, regardless who exercises those public functions. And as we see in many countries, a privatisation of services traditionally provided by the state, maintaining that distinction I think is the important one. I think we should simply say, if it's something that we would define it as a public function, whoever carries it out, whether it's state-employed police or privately employed companies, it should be subject to the appropriate supervision and control.
I'm sorry, by the first question I thought I was going to ask the first part of Khadija's comments. Okay, and Khadija, I've heard of your story before from Amin, and I greatly respect the choices that you've made in this. But I have to say that I disagree a little bit with Andrew, and perhaps I don't know to what extent with you also on this, that I don't think the existing mechanisms suffice. I don't think the existing private contracts suffice. In one case, they've worked, and for you, they've worked, from what I understand, with difficulty. At first, they didn't immediately remove the video, and later on, they might have changed their minds. But the fact is, I think we have to we have to hold on to two principles here. One is the principle of transparency, and here we have to be a little bit pragmatic as well. So we have to know if upon a user complaint, if on the basis of terms of service, if something is removed, we should know. On the Google transparency report right now, for instance, one thing we don't know is what percentage of what was removed was on the basis of terms of service violation, and what percentage was for other kinds of legal violations or violations of the law of the land. Again, I think knowing this is very important, especially with companies taking on the powers of state without the limitations and responsibilities of states. Okay, so I think this transparency principle is very important. I think chillingeffects.org is playing a great role here. They're understaffed, underfunded, etc., etc. But we can adopt national models, I believe, of chilling effects. The one problem here, of course, is that of pragmatism, how much information can be uploaded onto these servers as to what you're removing. Okay, but the second thing is on court orders, right? Now, in India, when we were faced with the bad intermediary guidelines, the takedown process, we actually worked on it for around 8-9 months, and we proposed an alternative. In the alternative, we make some slight concessions for online removal. We don't say first you have to get a court order and only then can you remove. We say, and I believe this, that you can allow them to remove it, but it has to be backed up within within a few weeks with a court order, because you can't establish two different levels of accountability. For if you want to ban a book, you require a court order in India. But if you want to ban something else on the internet, if you don't require a court order, you're setting up a whole new standard, and I don't think that is correct. The problem with court orders is twofold. One, with bad magistracy and bad judges who don't necessarily make constitutional decisions. The second is that of jurisdiction. So increasingly we have the capacity of companies to limit the blocking of stuff to a particular country. They do it for copyright, they also do it for other kinds of stuff. But the one interesting part comes up with courts having local jurisdiction, meaning subnational jurisdiction. If something is to be blocked in one state in India or one district in India, then how do ISPs or other companies go about doing so without blocking it in the rest of India, where it's not been adjudicated to be illegal? Okay, so these kinds of issues also would arise, but I think these twin principles, you can't prohibit a company from removing stuff. You can't say if you don't want to have nudity, even artistic nudity on your website, you shall be forced to have it. We can't do that, even though we can force a government, that principle upon a government. Okay, but we have to find some via media here, and I think it's going to be really difficult to negotiate principles of private property and contract and see how that works.
Thank you for the question, for the remark. Just to clarify what I wanted to express earlier, I think that the key point is that it's not clear, particularly in our part of the world, the emerging countries, particularly in the Middle East, if a content is found offensive to a large number of people, how would they raise their concern, and if there is any process for them to ensure that this concern is addressed and the result of this concern is shown in a transparent way. I think there needs to be a mechanism where if a content is found offensive, that this is raised, taken into consideration, and the decision that's taking it down or not is communicated in a transparent way. The drawback of not having such a mechanism and awareness of such a mechanism exists is what we have seen in terms of demonstrations. And I don't think demonstrations of that sort is beneficial to anybody, either for the countries where they happen or for the world in general. So there should be, there was really a feeling that whatever you do, whatever voice you raise, your concern will not be heard, and the process will continue as it is. And I don't think this is really what the appropriate way to address issues of that scale, particularly of that scale. I know that the video was taken down by Google in a couple of countries, but again, I don't think this is the way to address this concern. I think transparency and the decision-making process by over-the-top operators or the hosting companies needs to be quite openly communicated, and the weight of the public opinion should be taken into consideration. I'm not talking about governments. I don't think governments should intervene, but the opinion of the public should be taken into consideration.
Well, only just one more remark. I think over the last couple of years we have seen a lot of public-private partnerships, and in parts of Europe it became a sort of fashion. And and there might be some good cases, best practices in such partnerships, but I would always like, please be more careful. Please don't start glorifying this as a new way out of the traditional dilemmas, etc. And please, let's be sure. What are the liabilities? What is the responsibility from private partners towards the public providing public services or public-like services? The examples Andrew used before. I think we have to be much more clearer in this respect. We have to define roles, rules and responsibilities. And I think if there is a responsibility from the actors towards the public, then I think we are on the right way. But I'm a little bit afraid. Let's take the example of Switzerland. Switzerland was known over many years for a variety of public services: energy, education, healthcare, media. And more such public services are partly privatized, etc. And public services are somehow on the way to disappear, to evaporate. Because conservative politicians always argue, well, why should the government or the public sector do this? But in many of the cases where the public sector is not responsible any longer, the quality diminished. And of course it makes sense for the metropolitan areas in Switzerland to privatize this because it's lucrative enough. But what about the people in the marginalized areas of the country? And we have to think about this as well. And therefore I'm very skeptical about this typology of public-private partnerships. Thanks.
People who want to raise questions, can they raise their hands? There's a few at the back. In the meantime, while I come and bring the mic over to you, we've had a very interesting point raised, which is around what you said was a large group of people found this offensive. Now, Google traditionally argue that they use a First Amendment standard around freedom of expression. So they will say that something that is found grossly offensive, traditionally they won't take it down from their services. I'd be interested to hear, Abhilash, how do we approach either a different cultural approach to freedom of expression, and is it right for US service providers to hold up this very high standard of freedom of expression across the world when dealing with these sorts of complaints?
Thank you, Michael. There is no straightforward answer to that question, unfortunately. Before we start looking at how that standard can be enforced outside of the US, I think perhaps we should think about if that standard is enforced within the US itself. When the legislation I talked about earlier, the first Communications Decency Act in 1996, which tried to protect children from exposure to inappropriate content, one of the criticisms which was advanced in the court and bought by the courts as well was that how can you apply a uniform standard for free speech across the US? Because within the US itself there are states with slightly different community standards. There are more liberal states where content might be acceptable, but the same content might offend in a more conservative state elsewhere. So it was rather unconstitutional to expect a publisher to comply with the most restrictive standard that applies within the US itself. So it was one of the reasons which was advanced at the litigation. But eventually the decision was, no, if a publisher chooses to publish online, then you may as well comply with the law of wherever it can be reached within the country. Now, if you take that outside the US, then obviously it raises further challenges. Where do you set the standard for free speech? At a European level, you can argue Article 10, which is broad enough, but not quite as broad as the First Amendment right in the US. So, which is again one of the factors which was considered when recently when the UK government announced that proposed legislation to protect children from exposure to inappropriate content, and how do you balance free speech rights on the one hand and the need to protect children on the other. I can actually think from purely a pornography point of view, if you were to find a standard globally for that, perhaps you can look to, say, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and say that, well, Article 3 says that children should be protected from exploitation. We shall do things that are in the best interest of a child. And a child who cannot go into a sex shop, a physical sex shop, because of age restrictions, can actually access pornography on the internet without actually revealing who they are. Now, would that contravene, would that go against the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? Yes, but has the US signed the convention? Probably not. So there are wider issues which cannot be answered in one sentence, I'm afraid, but tricky one.
Okay, we're going to bring in some more contributions. We'll take it in threes.
Hello, can you hear me? My name's Helen Goodman. I'm a member of Parliament in Great Britain. I'm not a member of the government, I'm a member of the Labour Party. I'm not at all clear that the situation we find ourselves in is one where there are new issues of principle or new philosophical dilemmas. I think it's more that we've got new practical problems that we need to sort out. And on the fundamental question about free speech, I'm British. I think Article 10 gets the balance right. I'm not very comfortable with the American one for reasons I'll explain in a minute. And I'm certainly not comfortable with the situation the colleague from Azerbaijan finds herself in. So I think rather than assuming that these are new dilemmas, I really don't think they are. And it seems to me that it is reasonable to protect vulnerable people, that defamation is something around which we've had rules for at least 150 years, and we need to continue to have them. And speaking absolutely frankly, I cannot imagine any government in their right mind not taking account of security issues. I think it would really be quite irresponsible. So what that takes me to is this question about public accountability. And what I feel is that we need much clearer rules of the game. And we've got big legal loopholes. We've certainly got big legal loopholes in Britain at the moment. We're taking through Parliament a defamation bill, as well as having a consultation on the rather more controversial communications bill But as well as having proper public accountability, I just want to raise two other thoughts. One is, speaking personally, and I'm surprised other people don't feel this, I think that the private organisations have too much power and too much secrecy, and they're not accountable to anybody. I feel this quite strongly about Google, and I also feel it quite strongly about ICANN, who can't vouch for the domain, the real life reality of the website domains. I think these things are problematic, and I think that as well as looking to public accountability for various functions, we do need to start thinking about international rules of the game.
I'm going to direct that question when it's answered at Camino and Andrew.
Hello, I'm Chinmayi. I'm a fellow at the Center for Internet and Society, and I'm an assistant professor at National Law University, Delhi. I must thank Helen for raising the questions that she did, because mine are actually very closely related. I accept. So I'm beginning on the premise that a private entity that performs a public function needs to come under enhanced transparency and accountability rules. I think that goes almost without saying. But I'd like to take what Helen was saying further as far as the international values are concerned. I've just come, to put this in context, just 4 days back I attended the Cybersecurity Summit run by the East-West Clinic in India, and there were many members from both private companies as well as the government attending that summit. And the entire conversation was about the very legitimate cybersecurity issues, cybercrime, how do we tackle it around the world. And the part of this conversation that I found really disturbing was that as we're having this conversation about how to create an architecture and a legal system that permits us to take care of cybercrime and to cooperate and to provide information and surveil, everybody sort of hands off on the values of privacy as they vary across the world. And I think that that's also going to become an important question now. I don't think that in a globalized world, or even in a world in which we claim to respect human rights, it's okay for everyone to say that, yeah, well, you just do this according to your country's regulations. It's very different when we're talking about cultural standards of what is offensive in one country may not be as offensive in another country, versus when we're talking about countries that have widely varying principles on whether you can violate privacy at all or not, or whether there are mechanisms, specific mechanisms, like the EU protects privacy in very detailed and specific fashions. My country, in principle, has a right to privacy, but no specific mechanisms are required, which means that implementation becomes very difficult. And I think that in this context, when these conversations are happening and when these mechanisms are being set up, it's time to come up with a bare global minimum standard. And to have this conversation about how responsible it is for various countries that have great human rights regimes and democratic processes within their countries to refuse to mandate that these processes are embedded in a way in which they cannot be violated, when cybercrime conventions or surveillance technology is being sold across the world. And I think that how to achieve that, what kind of how we would pick up values from both international instruments as well as sort of general principles of human rights, and how we would sort of translate them such that they would be acceptable around the world is a question that many of you will need to answer. Sorry, that was quite long.
I'm going to direct that at Hussein. I'd also like to add to that, has the specific experience of the revolution altered Egyptians' view of privacy? I'm going to take one more question on this side. If there's anyone else who wants to answer a question on this side? No? Okay. Hussein, do you want to start?
Thank you, Michael, for addressing yet another question. But that's certainly the Egyptian revolution has brought again to the front the issue of social media and the use of social media for people to start campaigns, share their opinions, and rally support across the population. And that wasn't really tapped or seen before by the government. After the revolution, the interest in social media has continued and is continuing. and we see people getting online or getting accounts on the internet, on the DSL or any other mechanism, just for the mere reason to be connected to social media. Of course, privacy is a concern, and concerns with privacy have also raised after the revolution, because the mere number of people communicating, not only a number but also the graphics of people. Some of them are illiterate, but they know which keyboards they can punch to get online and see the pictures or enter opinion. Now we don't have yet a framework, legal framework to set privacy issues straight, and that's one of the 4 laws that relate to telecommunications and IPRs that are being brought in front of the new parliament when it gets into session, hopefully by beginning of next year. So to answer your question, yes, privacy issues are now a big concern, and we know that the existing framework does not touch on privacy issues, particularly that relate to online. We have seen a draft of this issue, of this some aspects of this law. We provide opinion to. But we see another important issue regarding privacy, not only for national institutions, private sector or operators that can share users' information, but more so from over-the-top operators who have access perhaps to more information than national operators. And they have the freedom to share this information whoever they see fit, for marketing purposes or for money-generating purposes or other purposes. And we see this loophole in most laws across the Middle East where it has been adopted such privacy laws. This is a concern that we as Internet society in Egypt try to raise, to bring to the front, make sure that when we drafting such actions, such laws, that they address both national operators or national players as well as international players as much as possible, of course.
I'm going to just bring in quickly in Pranesh on this point on privacy.
Thanks, Mike. I'd just like to point out that global minimum standards in regard to privacy are never going to emerge, not from governments, definitely. And insofar as they can emerge from other parts when it comes to privacy standards regarding corporations and things like the right to be forgotten, they're way too contentious. There's no agreement. So even with regard to corporations, they can't arise even outside of an intergovernmental space, even within civil society. So I think, but what we can work towards is ways to address violations or what are perceived as violations, and ways to get governments into those platforms. So I think that kind of an multi-stakeholder perhaps, or even intergovernmental mechanism is something that can be worked towards. But in terms of just standards, I don't think it's ever going to happen.
To reply the lady from the UK. First, in my intervention, the first thing I mentioned is that public institutions can ultimately be held responsible for the inaction, and we take due account of the fact that the internet is 90%, well, I don't know exactly the percentage, but highly managed and controlled by private sector, and I share some of your concerns. I can tell you that we implement self-regulation where we cannot regulate, and we regulate where we can, and one of the evidences is Article 13A of the new telecom framework, that actually forces security companies to disclose security breaches, which can actually have a strong impact in the privacy of citizens. In terms of security, in terms of security and the threats to privacy, I would also like to remind you that security is a competence of member states, and we have a limited leeway there. And thirdly, addressing ICANN, you can resort, if you want, to our website where we have 4 fiches addressing the corporate responsibility of ICANN to try to ensure that it has the maximum level of accountability, transparency, and also accountancy. I don't know if that replies to your broad question.
Yeah, just to pick up on Helen's points, it's great to see a legislator here, actually. We don't see enough legislators in these forums. Too often it's just government, business and civil society. I mean, firstly, I agree with you. I don't think the issues around censorship, the principles, the values are fundamentally different online or offline. I don't think human rights are fundamentally different online or offline. It's a set of practical problems that are presented to us. So I think you're right there. And I think the key to it is, as you said, accountability and ensuring that the mechanisms we have to deal with legitimate concerns are genuinely accountable. And I think a number of us are worried, not recognising the need for child protection, whether all the mechanisms that exist to enable child protection in the online world are genuinely accountable, whether some of them don't capture a whole number of, say, lesbian and gay networks and organisations, as well as organisations that are sexually exploiting children. I think there's a number of concerns about the effectiveness of that system as it operates globally. And I think a number of us will be very concerned at the sense that you need a global set of rules to govern the internet. I'm not quite sure if that's what you meant, but I would be very concerned in terms of free expression, whose rules would predominate in an international arena. I happen to prefer the US approach to defamation to the British approach to defamation, as do many wealthy people who litigate to defend their reputations from legitimate criticism, because our defamation laws are wholly biased towards the wealthy and powerful and against the public interest. I'm less keen on the US tolerance of hate speech, but that's part of their cultural fabric, and I don't think it's for the international community to impose upon the US our standards on hate speech on their particular jurisdiction. So I think we have to recognise there are different value systems in the world. And part of the joy of the internet is you can choose by what you select and how you act the kind of value systems you prefer. And I'm really not convinced that a global regulation would solve the problems of censorship in the way that you suggest, in the way that I don't know if you were suggesting, but I thought I got a hint of that. And lastly, on the companies, I think the companies a growing number of companies are too powerful, they are too dominant. And I think the solution is effective enforcement of anti-monopoly and competition law to allow new entrants into the market to break up those monopolies. And I think where protections come into force, governments have a responsibility that in the internet they've largely chosen not to exercise to make sure that certain standards are protected. So I think in terms of your discussion, the interesting battle for me in the next 2 years will be in Europe over privacy protection, because there's a European privacy directive designed to upgrade data protection law to bring it into line with the impact of the internet. Google have said it's the end of the internet. What they actually mean is it's the end of Google's business model, which is not yet quite the same thing as the end of the internet. But let me just challenge, any legislator. Can you guarantee that that directive will pass through 27 national legislatures in Europe and go through and become an enforceable European directive, or will the companies win that battle in a battle with democratically elected governments? If I was a betting person, I'd put my money on the companies winning that battle, unfortunately, rather than the governments of Europe supporting that directive. But we'll see. But that's partly your job as a legislator, to go back and make sure those protections exist and make sure that effective competition law, and I think that's the way of dealing with large monopoly companies, is if necessary, break them up, as we broke up monopolies in the past, and ensure proper competition.
I feel that the lack of microphones and the fact that we haven't been able to have a simultaneous conversation is almost like a parable for how technology impacts on freedom of expression. I think what we'll do now is we'll have a quick 1 minute summing up from the panelists. I'd like them to slightly address the question of who polices the big corporations, or is it good? Who polices the large corporations, or is it good? Or is it good in a sense, as we've seen from the audience, that nobody at present seems to be capable of doing so? So if we start with Pranesh.
You got me thinking on my feet. Well, I think everybody has to police the large corporations. I agree quite a bit with what Andrew said right at the end, that other than those kinds of direct mechanisms that exist currently, and I again emphasize that the two big issues for me are how do we deal with their rights to private property, how do we deal with their freedom of contract, without having answers for those. And these, to the limited extent that I disagree with the MP, I would say that these two are new issues that we are facing now because of the scale at which we are facing now. They've existed earlier, and they've been dealt with, but the scale is just gone off the charts now. And until we can come to some kind of consensus, we can only through dialogue in spaces like the IGF, I believe, and through dialogue between multiple stakeholders, until we come to some kind of consensus on those two very important issues, we can't come to the issue of policing corporations, because that's at the heart of how do we police corporations and to what extent should they be allowed to keep their freedoms. Thanks.
Well, I would argue in the same direction that the traditional regulation models are perdu. They don't exist. They cannot be adapted to the digital age any longer. Therefore, I think their key factors are empowerment of users. This is one of my key points: empowerment of the users. Know about your rights, what you can do. The more users are empowered, the better they can control private actors, etc. And I think it must be this common bottom-up responsibility. Don't trust in governments where you don't have to. And check and balance. So these are the traditional principles what made democracy strong. And I think we have to redefine these principles again. And the Coalition on Rights and Internet Rights and Principles has made a very important effort in the right direction, and I think this is the line we have to continue our work. Thanks.
Thank you. Who polices the large corporations? A lot of ISPs are these days very large corporations, and clearly there should be accountability for what they do. For instance, if they get a complaint about an illegal content, a website hosting illegal content, whether they actually investigate the merits of the complaint or do they just take it off to avoid liability is a question. We heard two different models here, one as a question and also as a comment here from the panel. One was to require ISPs to obtain a court order first before you take down content, which is good in an ideal world, but because the time it may take, it may be too late for a lot of content or later a lot of complaints. The second model, which was heard, was a court order later, which is the case in India, I suppose. It's a proposal in India at the time. Now, it's fine, it's better than the other one, but the problem is it will obviously have a lot of cost implications for ISPs if to obtain a court order every time content has been removed, so taking the wider world, global scene, that is. So can we find a middle ground between the two? The UK has a model to offer, the Internet Watch Foundation, which acts as an independent body. There are criticisms of IWF, but nonetheless, they've done excellent work in reducing the number of child pornographic websites hosted in the UK. And they do investigate complaints, and they look into the merits of the complaint, and then they ask an ISP to take down that content, which is, a bit like a quasi-judicial body, if you like, still works. But there are criticisms that they're not really transparent in the way they work. There is no appeals process beyond that. But I would think something like that would work a lot better than requiring corporations to obtain a court order or either before or after taking down content.
I think the answer to big companies is effective regulation, business regulation and competition law. But it's a very big challenge. Apple are now the largest company in the world with a market cap of around $600 billion. And they have a war chest, a cash float of at least $50 billion, which means they can spend they can do a lot of litigating to crush their opponents in a lot of courts if they choose to. At a recent case involving an attempted telecoms merger in the US, the Justice Department that deals with competition had about 30 lawyers working on the case. The telecoms companies put 600 lawyers in the field to work on that merger case. They bought up every lawyer in Washington who was unattached to a law firm. You just couldn't buy a lawyer. There was no lawyers available because they were all working on the merger. Now, the Justice happened to win that case, which is great news, but it shows you the unequal scale of the competition. And I think the other thing that governments could do is ensure that the large communications companies that are making a lot of money pay the tax on their earnings in the jurisdictions where they earn the money and not where they're legally registered, because these companies are massive tax avoiders who are robbing the public exchequer and then handing out a little bit of grants, a little bit of favours, sponsoring Google Big Tent, which I declare interest. I'm going to it tonight because it's going to be a great event. But I expect them to pay their taxes like any other business in the country, but legislators have got to do this. You've got to sit down with your fellow legislators and governments and decide you're actually going to create that framework to ensure these companies don't operate and don't make money, but pay a fair tax and are not allowed to monopolise the market.
I think that regulation is not always the solution, and that we have to look for long-term solutions that bring about a change for corporate cultures. My personal impression, I take off the hat of the European Commission, is that with most of the times with legal solutions, we're running the risk of entering a cat and mouse game, which is what I've seen. And also competition law is sometimes not really best placed to address problems related, for instance, with intellectual property rights or criminal law. So, I would also like to say that it would be easier for us to, in order to address the magnitude of the problem, to have also real statistics coming from law enforcement agencies. Because so far, through reports like the Google report on transparency, we know on the side of the private company how many requests of access to information have received, but we never have access to law enforcement data. And that would actually help us very much balance our actions.
Yes, to the first part of the question, it's obvious that there's nobody policing large corporations. Basically, they have the authority to make decisions and influence and go forward with decisions without giving any justification or transparency to how decisions were made. I like the argument that the public has a role to play, and the public has a decision to make to participate in these services or to abstain from participating in these services. And we have seen regarding mobile operators, for example, when prices were hiked, two of them agreed to hiking the prices. Basically, public decided 2 days without mobile service, and you can imagine the loss of revenue for these. And recently, after the movie issue, a group of people also decided to abstain from using YouTube and Facebook for a week's time. So I think the public has a role to play, and maybe we should start from bottom up approach, mobilize the public, and then government intervention through right policy making and regulation will certainly emphasize the solution.
Well, our policy pamphlet is available